I froze in the doorway, watching my parents hang college graduation photos of their new adopted son over mine as my father glanced back saying, "You were always a disappointment." My childhood trophies already packed in boxes, where family heirlooms once promised to me now displayed proudly for him. The text message from my mother arrived during a particularly tedious budget meeting, the unexpected dinner invitation breaking a 3-month silence that had followed our last strained interaction. "Daniel, your father and I would like you to join us for dinner this Friday. 7 p.m., there's someone important we want you to meet." The formal tone and unusual phrasing immediately triggered my professional analytical instincts. After 15 years of predictable communication patterns, this deviation suggested something significant had changed. My mother's messages typically included unnecessary details about menu plans or casual inquiries about my week. This terse instruction more closely resembled a business directive than a family invitation. Nevertheless, I responded with simple confirmation. Whatever important person warranted breaking the established silence pattern would likely provide insight into my parents' recent withdrawal from our already complicated relationship. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable rain, the weather mirroring my unacknowledged apprehension as I navigated the familiar drive to my childhood home. The sprawling Tudor-style house where I'd grown up appeared much the same as always: meticulously maintained gardens, perfectly positioned landscape lighting, the calculated display of success my father had always prioritized over comfort. I noticed an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked in the circular driveway, recent model, European, the kind of ostentatious status symbol my father typically criticized others for purchasing while maintaining his own collection of investment vehicles. Another inconsistency adding to the evening's growing strangeness. My mother answered the door with an expression I hadn't seen before, a peculiar combination of excitement and apprehension, her usual composed greeting replaced by distracted efficiency as she ushered me inside. "Perfect timing, everyone's already here," she announced, leading me toward the dining room rather than the living room where family gatherings traditionally began. The first abnormality registered immediately upon entering: someone was sitting in my place at the table. Not just any place, but the specific chair that had been designated as mine throughout my entire life, positioned to my father's right as befit the only son and presumed future legacy bearer. A man approximately my age, early 30s, immaculately dressed in what appeared to be a bespoke suit, with carefully styled dark hair and the practiced smile of someone accustomed to creating favorable first impressions. He remained seated as I entered, his proprietary positioning at the family table suggesting established comfort rather than guest status. My father stood when I entered, his characteristic command presence somewhat diminished by what appeared to be genuine nervousness, another unprecedented aberration in his typically unshakable demeanor. "Daniel, we'd like you to meet Lucas," he announced with unusual formality. "He's become an important part of our lives over the past few months." Before I could formulate an appropriate response to this peculiar introduction, my mother interrupted with what she clearly intended as a joyful pronouncement: "We've adopted Lucas as our son." The statement hung in the air with absurd incongruity. My parents were in their mid-60s. I was 34 years old. The concept of them suddenly adopting a man approximately my age defied logical explanation. "Adopted," I repeated carefully, looking between my parents and this stranger occupying my place. "In what sense exactly?" "Legally," my father clarified, his business tone emerging as it always did when he felt challenged. "We've completed the adult adoption process. Lucas is officially part of our family now." Lucas finally stood, extending his hand with practiced charm. "It's great to finally meet you, brother. Your parents have told me so much about you." I accepted the handshake automatically, professional training overriding emotional response as I processed this surreal scenario with analytical detachment. His grip was perfectly calibrated, firm enough to project confidence without crossing into dominance display, his eye contact similarly balanced between engagement and respect. Everything about his presentation suggested careful calibration. "Interesting," I replied neutrally. "I seem to be at a disadvantage, as this is the first I'm hearing about any of this." A flicker of tension crossed my mother's face, quickly replaced by the social smile she deployed during uncomfortable country club interactions. Well, it all happened rather quickly. Lucas came into our lives at exactly the right moment. 6 months is hardly quick for such a significant decision, I observed, the timeline inconsistency confirming my suspicion that this relationship had been deliberately concealed. My father's expression hardened with the familiar disappointment I'd seen throughout my childhood. "We didn't need your approval, Daniel. Lucas has shown more understanding and appreciation for our values in 6 months than you have in 34 years. He's everything we always hoped for in a son," my mother added, placing her hand on Lucas's arm with maternal pride that had rarely been directed toward me. "He's going to take over your father's business interests. He truly understands the legacy we've built." Each statement landed with calculated precision, decades of intimate knowledge allowing them to target exact vulnerabilities despite my carefully constructed professional facade. The business I had declined to join despite my father's insistence. The legacy I had supposedly rejected by pursuing my own career path rather than following his predetermined plan. Lucas maintained a perfectly composed expression of sympathetic discomfort, the appropriate response of someone witnessing family tension while remaining above involvement. The performance was flawless, which only intensified my analytical suspicion. "I see," I replied evenly. "And what exactly is Lucas's background that qualifies him for this unexpected role?" The question triggered immediate defensiveness from both parents, their synchronized response suggesting this topic had been anticipated and prepared for. "Lucas has extensive experience in investment management," my father stated firmly. "Princeton undergraduate, MBA from Wharton. He's been advising us on portfolio optimization since we met." Lucas smiled modestly. "Your father's giving me too much credit. I've simply helped identify some opportunities they were missing." His carefully calibrated humility contradicted the subtle dominance of his positioning, seated at my place, dressed to mirror my father's style preferences, demonstrating insider knowledge of family dynamics. Every element suggested methodical integration rather than coincidental connection. "And how exactly did you meet my parents?" I asked directly, maintaining neutral tone despite growing internal certainty that something fundamentally wrong was unfolding. A momentary hesitation, almost imperceptible but significant given his otherwise flawless performance. "Through the Westlake Foundation charity auction. We discovered shared interests in art collection and financial management." The reference instantly triggered recognition. The Westlake Foundation was indeed a legitimate organization, but it was also known within financial circles for its exclusive events catering to wealthy older couples, particularly those with significant investment portfolios and philanthropic inclinations. The perfect hunting ground for someone targeting specific victim demographics. Before I could pursue this line of questioning, my father intervened with uncharacteristic abruptness. "Enough interrogation, Daniel. This dinner was to inform you of our decision, not to seek your approval. We'd hoped you might actually be happy for us," my mother added, her expression conveying familiar disappointment. "But you've always struggled with change." I maintained composed observation, watching the subtle interactions between my parents and their new son, the synchronized defenses, the practice dynamic, the proprietary comfort he displayed in what had been my childhood home. Every detail suggesting extended integration rather than recent introduction. "I'm simply trying to understand the situation," I explained calmly. Adult adoption is an unusual and permanent legal arrangement, typically pursued for specific estate planning purposes rather than emotional connection. The directness of this observation visibly unsettled my parents while eliciting a microsecond flash of calculation from Lucas before his expression returned to practice concern. "Your analytical approach to everything has always been your limitation, Daniel," my father stated with the definitive tone he used for inarguable pronouncements. "Not everything can be reduced to spreadsheets and logical assessment. Which is precisely why we've connected so deeply with Lucas," my mother continued seamlessly. "He understands the emotional dimensions you've always dismissed. I maintained neutral expression despite the familiar criticism, the lifetime pattern of no response ever being quite right, no achievement ever quite sufficient, no effort ever fully acknowledged. I'm simply surprised by such a significant decision made without any previous mention, I noted, careful to avoid defensive tone despite the deliberate provocations. My father's patience visibly expired, the familiar transformation from strained tolerance to open disappointment that had characterized my childhood achievements. Always almost enough, but never quite measuring up to undefined standards. This is exactly why we proceeded as we did, he declared with finality. Your perpetual questioning, your inability to simply accept our choices. You've always been a disappointment in that regard, Daniel. Always analyzing instead of supporting. The words themselves weren't new. Variations of disappointment had punctuated my childhood and adult relationship with both parents. What distinguished this instance was the comparative element introduced by Lucas's presence, the explicit replacement rather than isolated criticism. Lucas understands family loyalty, my mother added, her hand still resting on his arm with proprietary pride. He appreciates what we've built without constantly questioning our values. The choreographed nature of their united criticism suggested prepared positioning rather than spontaneous reaction. This wasn't an impromptu defense but a planned declaration, the dinner designed specifically to establish new family hierarchy with formal witness. I allowed a measured silence before responding, professional training overriding emotional reaction as I processed strategic implications rather than personal impact. I appreciate your candor, I finally replied, maintaining eye contact with my father. And I respect your legal right to make this decision. The deliberately neutral response visibly unsettled them, the expected emotional reaction or defensive argument conspicuously absent. Lucas's expression briefly revealed calculation recalibration, suggesting anticipated conflict response rather than composed acceptance. Dinner proceeded with excruciating politeness, my parents alternating between extolling Lucas's virtues and referencing investment opportunities he had apparently identified for their considerable retirement portfolio. Each mention providing additional confirmation of my growing suspicion, this wasn't merely unusual family dynamics but something potentially predatory. Throughout the meal, I maintained careful observation while revealing nothing of my internal assessment. Professional training from years of corporate restructuring providing perfect preparation for this unexpected personal application, identification of inconsistencies without revealing recognition, gathering information while appearing to accept presented narrative. As coffee was served, Lucas casually mentioned finalizing the paperwork next week, a vague reference that triggered immediate subject change from my father. Another data point suggesting financial transactions beyond the adoption itself. When I finally departed several hours later, Lucas walked me to the door with practiced collegiality, the perfect performance of newly established sibling attempting connection. I know this must be strange, he offered with calibrated understanding. But I truly care about your parents. They've been so generous in welcoming me into their lives. I smiled with professional cordiality that revealed nothing of my internal assessment. Family can be complicated. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to get better acquainted. Driving away from my childhood home, I didn't indulge in emotional processing of being explicitly replaced and declared at disappointment, yet again. Instead, I began methodically organizing observed inconsistencies and potential research avenues, the analytical approach my father had just criticized transforming from supposed weakness into strategic advantage. My parents had apparently adopted a replacement son who had appeared suddenly in their lives, gained their complete trust within months, and was now involved in their financial affairs despite having no verifiable connection prior to 6 months ago. They thought they were establishing a new family hierarchy. They didn't realize they were potentially revealing a sophisticated predator's operation. And their disappointment of a son was uniquely qualified to recognize it. I arrived home from my parents' revelation dinner with cold strategic focus rather than emotional turmoil. The apartment that typically served as refuge from corporate battlefield intensity now transformed into investigation headquarters, multiple screens activated, secure databases accessed, professional research tools deployed for decidedly personal application. The name, Lucas Bennett, as he had been introduced, provided initial search parameters, though my professional experience suggested this would likely be a constructed identity rather than traceable history. Nevertheless, methodical process required starting with presented information before pursuing deeper investigation avenues. The preliminary search confirmed my suspicion. Lucas Bennett existed on paper with a carefully established digital footprint. LinkedIn profile showing appropriate educational credentials and career progression. Facebook and Instagram accounts with curated content suggesting the successful investment advisor persona he had presented. Even a professional website with testimonials from satisfied clients. All perfectly constructed. All relatively recent. The Princeton and Wharton credentials appeared legitimate according to alumni databases, though tellingly absent from archived graduation publications I accessed through professional subscription services. The employment history similarly tracked without physical documentation, digital presence without confirmable reality markers. By 2 a.m., I had established preliminary timeline inconsistencies, the professional history showing impossible overlaps, the digital footprint creation clustered within specific time periods suggesting identity establishment rather than natural development, the social media connections revealing suspicious network patterns typical of constructed personas. The most revealing discovery came through specialized financial industry databases not accessible to the general public. Lucas Bennett had no registered history with SEC or FINRA despite claiming investment advisory activities. No legitimate financial professional could operate without these basic regulatory registrations, their absence confirming my suspicion that my parents had welcomed an unqualified individual into their financial affairs. I shifted to deeper background investigation, utilizing facial recognition software from my firm's security division to search for matches outside the Lucas Bennett identity parameters. The technology, designed for corporate intelligence applications, required significant processing time, allowing brief rest while maintaining investigation momentum. By morning, the facial recognition search had yielded critical results. 3 potential matches with different names across multiple states over the past decade. Michael Thornton, in Arizona, 2016 to 2018. James Wilson, in Florida, 2018 to 2020. Thomas Wright, in Colorado, 2020 to 2022. Each identity showing similar patterns, integration with wealthy older couples, financial advisory relationships, followed by significant asset transfers before disappearance. The pattern confirmation shifted my strategy from investigation to evidence compilation, methodical documentation of findings, cross-referencing multiple information sources, establishing verifiable timeline rather than speculative connections. Professional habits serving personal necessity with practiced efficiency. I canceled my morning appointments, citing family emergency with uncharacteristic truth, and continued building the evidence portfolio with focused intensity. The familiar analytical process that had advanced my corporate career now directed toward protecting my parents from what appeared to be sophisticated financial predation. By mid-afternoon, I had established sufficient pattern verification to justify deeper investigation methods. The corporate intelligence resources typically reserved for high-stakes acquisitions now deployed to access legal records across multiple jurisdictions, the ethically ambiguous application justified by potential victim protection rather than competitive advantage. The sealed court records revealed exactly what I had suspected, complaints filed by previous victims describing nearly identical methodology. Sophisticated con artist who targeted wealthy older couples, typically those with strained relationships with adult children. Integration through charity events or upscale social gatherings. Rapid trust development through emotional connection and validation. Financial advisory relationship establishment followed by increasingly controlling influence isolation. Adult adoption suggestions as both emotional fulfillment and asset protection strategy. Most cases showed similar outcomes, substantial financial losses before family intervention or victim realization, followed by disappeared perpetrator with new identity establishment elsewhere. The legal records rarely showed successful prosecution due to victim reluctance to acknowledge manipulation, complicated by legal adoption creating legitimate family relationships in some instances. The most recent case, Thomas Wright, in Colorado, had ended approximately 8 months ago, aligning perfectly with Lucas Bennett's appearance in my parents' lives 6 months ago. The 2-month gap likely representing identity transition and target identification period. I compiled comprehensive documentation of each previous identity, creating chronological evidence portfolio establishing clear pattern recognition. Each case showing subtle methodology refinement while maintaining core approach consistency, the professional evolution of a sophisticated predator perfecting his technique through practical application. The financial dimension required more direct investigation. My father had always maintained careful privacy regarding specific investments and asset holdings, but certain basic information remained accessible through public records. Property ownership, business registrations, tax assessment records, all providing framework understanding while requiring deeper examination for comprehensive financial vulnerability assessment. My corporate position provided unusual advantage for this investigation phase, the restructuring specialization requiring rapid financial analysis capability without complete information access. Years of practice extracting critical insights from limited data sources now applied to protecting family rather than optimizing acquisition strategy. By evening, I had established concerning preliminary findings, recent property transfers showing joint ownership additions, business registration modifications suggesting authority changes, and investment account management alterations filed with state agencies. Each change individually defensible as estate planning adjustment but collectively representing comprehensive control transfer pattern consistent with previous victim experiences. The most alarming discovery came through specialized database access revealing recent mortgage application against my parents' previously unencumbered primary residence. The substantial credit line, $1.2 million against a property worth approximately $3.8 million, had been initiated 3 weeks earlier with closing scheduled for the following week. The application documentation showing joint signature authorization including Lucas Bennett as legal family member. This pending transaction represented immediate financial vulnerability requiring priority attention before addressing the broader situation. The timeline suggesting strategic acceleration following my unexpected dinner invitation, the implementation schedule likely adjusted to accommodate potential interference recognition. I shifted focus to comprehensive financial investigation, utilizing specialized forensic accounting techniques typically reserved for fraud detection in corporate acquisitions. The methodical examination revealing disturbing patterns in my parents' financial activities over the past 4 months. 1. Investment portfolio liquidations converting long-term holdings into more accessible assets. 2. Banking relationship changes consolidating previously diversified accounts. 3. Retirement account beneficiary modifications adding Lucas while removing previous designations. 4. Estate planning document revisions eliminating extended family provisions. 5. Life insurance policy adjustments naming Lucas as primary beneficiary, each change representing subtle control consolidation rather than immediate asset extraction, the sophisticated methodology focusing on long-term acquisition rather than obvious theft. The approach designed specifically to avoid typical financial exploitation detection patterns while establishing comprehensive eventual control. The most concerning element emerged through trust documentation analysis. My father's previously established family trust apparently dissolved and replaced with new legal structure naming Lucas as both beneficiary and successor trustee. The modification paperwork showing execution approximately 6 weeks earlier, suggesting rapid acceleration following legal adoption completion. By midnight, I had compiled comprehensive evidence portfolio organized into clear categories: identity verification, documentation proving Lucas Bennett as constructed identity with multiple previous iterations, victim pattern recognition, court records and complainant statements from previous targets showing methodology consistency, financial vulnerability documentation, comprehensive analysis of recent financial control transfers and pending transactions, legal control modifications. Detailed examination of estate planning changes creating significant asset vulnerability timeline establishment. Chronological documentation showing pattern acceleration and implementation sequencing the evidence compilation revealing sophisticated operation beyond typical financial exploitation. A methodically implemented control acquisition strategy designed specifically to avoid standard protective interventions through relationship manipulation and legal structure utilization. Most concerning was the comprehensive nature of the approach, not simply financial exploitation but complete life integration including emotional manipulation, social isolation development, and identity replacement facilitation. The methodology suggesting experienced implementation refined through multiple previous applications rather than opportunistic advantage taking. I reviewed the complete evidence portfolio with professional detachment, assessing strategic response requirements rather than emotional reaction indulgence. The situation required immediate intervention while avoiding premature confrontation that might accelerate exploitation timeline or trigger evidence elimination. The morning would require careful planning implementation, legal consultation, financial protection initiation, and strategic approach development. The investigation confirming both pattern recognition and immediate vulnerability necessitating rapid response deployment while maintaining tactical discretion. As I finally allowed brief rest after nearly 24 hours of continuous investigation, my analytical focus momentarily yielded to personal recognition. My parents had not only replaced me with a constructed ideal but had done so with someone specifically targeting their vulnerabilities. The emotional manipulation simultaneously exploiting their disappointment in me while fulfilling their desired validation experience. The sophisticated predator had identified their specific psychological needs and methodically fulfilled them while systematically acquiring control of their financial resources. The exploitation simultaneously financial and emotional, targeting assets while manipulating insecurities and relationship vulnerabilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their disappointment, son now represented their only protection against the perfect replacement they had so eagerly embraced. Their lifelong criticism of my analytical approach and emotional distance now potentially saving them from a manipulator specifically exploiting their desire for emotional validation and connection. This recognition didn't trigger satisfaction or vindication but intensified protective determination, their vulnerability stemming from legitimate emotional needs rather than simple greed or superficiality. The sophisticated predator exploiting genuine psychological desires rather than merely financial opportunity. My investigation had confirmed not just criminal methodology but profound human vulnerability, parents seeking validation and connection manipulated by someone specifically targeting these emotional needs while systematically acquiring their financial resources. The evidence compilation represented more than fraud documentation. It revealed the mapping of psychological vulnerabilities specifically exploited through relationship manipulation. The approach targeting not just financial assets but identity and emotional fulfillment needs. This understanding informed necessary response development, addressing both financial protection requirements and underlying psychological vulnerability exploitation. The strategy needing to incorporate not merely asset security but relationship dynamic recognition and emotional support provision. By morning, the investigation had yielded comprehensive understanding beyond initial suspicion confirmation. The evidence trail establishing not merely criminal activity identification but vulnerability pattern recognition essential for effective intervention implementation. My parents had eagerly embraced a replacement son offering emotional validation. They didn't realize he represented a sophisticated predator specifically targeting their vulnerabilities. Their protection now depended on the analytical son they had always dismissed as a disappointment. The legal offices of Margaret Chen presented exactly the professional environment required for situation assessment, her specialized practice focusing on elder financial abuse providing perfect expertise combination for the complex circumstances my investigation had revealed. Her reputation for strategic intervention rather than reactive litigation aligned with my methodical approach to problem resolution. These findings are comprehensive and concerning, she acknowledged, reviewing the evidence portfolio I'd organized into clear presentation format. The pattern demonstrates sophisticated methodology rather than opportunistic exploitation. Exactly, I confirmed, appreciating her immediate pattern recognition. The documentation suggests multiple previous implementations with consistent approach refinement. My concern is the acceleration indicators following my unexpected appearance at their home. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, examining the financial transaction timeline I'd compiled. The mortgage application particularly suggests immediate intervention necessity. The closing scheduled for next week would create substantial new vulnerability while providing significant liquid asset access. My priority is protection implementation without premature confrontation, I explained. Direct accusation without adequate preparation would likely trigger both evidence elimination and emotional manipulation intensification. Agreed, she responded with professional efficiency. The adult adoption complicates standard intervention approaches but doesn't prevent appropriate protection implementation. We have several immediate options and longer-term strategies available. We spent the next 2 hours developing comprehensive response framework, immediate financial protection mechanisms, strategic legal intervention points, evidence preservation protocols, and confrontation preparation requirements. Each element carefully calibrated to address both urgent vulnerability minimization and longer-term protection establishment. The immediate priority is preventing the mortgage transaction completion, Margaret advised, identifying the most pressing vulnerability. We have legitimate intervention options through regulatory compliance requirements even without your parents' cooperation. This represented significant strategic advantage, the financial institution's legal obligations providing intervention mechanism without requiring direct confrontation or premature disclosure. The compliance framework creating protection opportunity without accusation necessity. Next came specific financial protection strategy development, selective intervention implementation targeting highest vulnerability areas while maintaining strategic concealment from the manipulator. Each protection mechanism designed for maximum effectiveness with minimum detection possibility. The trust modification presents more complex challenges, Margaret acknowledged, examining the legal documentation. The recent execution creates presumption of capacity, though the surrounding circumstances suggest potential undue influence considerations. I'm less concerned with immediate trust reversal than preventing further financial extraction, I clarified. The comprehensive approach can proceed in strategic phases rather than requiring simultaneous implementation. Margaret's approval was evident in her slight nod. That's refreshingly pragmatic. Most family members in these situations demand immediate comprehensive resolution without recognizing strategic patience benefits. By early afternoon, we had established clear intervention framework with specific implementation sequences. 1. Emergency financial transaction prevention focusing on pending mortgage application. 2. Strategic account protection implementation through regulatory compliance mechanisms. 3. Evidence preservation ensuring documentation availability for eventual confrontation. 4. Legal preparation for potential emergency intervention if acceleration indicators emerged. 5. Structured approach development for eventual controlled confrontation implementation. Each element carefully balanced between protection necessity and strategic concealment, preventing further exploitation while avoiding premature confrontation that might trigger evidence destruction or manipulation acceleration. From Margaret's office, I proceeded directly to my second critical consultation, meeting with financial fraud specialist Robert Jackson, whose experience with similar exploitation patterns would provide essential strategy refinement guidance. Your documentation is impressively thorough, he observed after reviewing the evidence portfolio. Most family members provide emotional suspicions rather than methodical pattern documentation. Professional habit application, I explained simply. The situation required objective assessment rather than reactive response. Robert nodded with professional appreciation before addressing strategic considerations. Based on the methodology documentation, you're dealing with a sophisticated operator who maintains awareness of intervention indicators. The acceleration following your unexpected appearance suggests recognition of potential threat to operation completion. Exactly my assessment, I confirmed. Which necessitates careful intervention implementation to prevent detection during initial protection phases. We spent the subsequent hours developing specific financial protection strategies, technical approaches to transaction prevention, account security implementation, and asset protection establishment. Each mechanism designed for maximum effectiveness with minimum visibility to the manipulator during implementation phase. The most complex dimension is the emotional manipulation component, Robert acknowledged, addressing the psychological aspects beyond financial exploitation. Your parents' vulnerability extends beyond financial control to identity and relationship manipulation. I've identified that as the most challenging intervention aspect, I agreed. The financial protection can proceed through established mechanisms, but addressing the psychological exploitation requires more nuanced approach development. Robert provided valuable insight from previous case experiences, patterns of victim response when confronted with exploitation evidence, psychological defense mechanisms typically deployed to avoid manipulation acknowledgement, and effective approach strategies for overcoming initial resistance to intervention acceptance. The replacement dynamic creates additional complexity, he noted, focusing on the unique dimension of my situation. The manipulator has positioned himself as the superior alternative to you specifically, creating identity investment beyond typical financial exploitation scenarios. This observation highlighted the central challenge of effective intervention. My parents hadn't merely been financially manipulated but had psychologically committed to the replacement narrative through public declaration and legal formalization. Their vulnerability extending beyond asset protection to fundamental identity and relationship reconfiguration. By evening, we had developed comprehensive financial protection implementation strategy, focused on immediate vulnerability prevention while establishing longer-term security framework. Each element carefully designed for maximum effectiveness with strategic implementation sequencing to minimize detection possibility during initial phases. My next meeting provided essential family dimension perspective, consultation with my mother's younger sister Catherine, the only extended family member who had maintained balanced relationship with both my parents and me throughout the strained dynamics of recent years. I've noticed concerning changes in their behavior, she confirmed after I shared selective findings without full exploitation disclosure. Your father canceled our monthly lunch meetings, and your mother has become increasingly difficult to reach directly. When we do speak, this Lucas person dominates the conversation despite my attempts to discuss other topics. Her observations aligned perfectly with the isolation pattern documentation from previous victim cases, strategic relationship interference with family members who might recognize manipulation indicators. The methodology specifically targeting potential intervention sources through systematic contact reduction and communication monitoring. Have they discussed any financial changes or unusual transactions recently? I inquired, seeking additional verification beyond my direct investigation findings. Catherine's response provided concerning confirmation. Your father mentioned exciting new investment opportunities requiring quick decision-making during our last conversation. When I asked for specifics, he became uncharacteristically evasive before changing the subject. That's completely inconsistent with his usual detailed financial discussions. This behavior modification represented classic manipulation indicator, the normally methodical, transparent financial manager suddenly embracing urgent, undefined opportunities, while avoiding specific discussion. The pattern consistent with previous victim behavior documentation showing personality and habit changes during exploitation progression. I need your help implementing protection strategies, I explained, outlining specific assistance requirements without comprehensive situation disclosure. Primarily maintaining normal contact patterns while observing behavioral indicators and providing strategic information when appropriate. Catherine agreed immediately, her genuine concern for my parents overriding any curiosity about withheld details. Her trusted position within the family creating essential observation channel for ongoing situation monitoring during intervention implementation. The final preparation phase addressed physical security considerations, ensuring access to important documents, family heirlooms, and irreplaceable items that might be vulnerable during confrontation phase. The previous case documentation revealing concerning pattern of personal property liquidation or disappearance during final exploitation stages. I developed careful approach for securing these items without alerting Lucas to intervention recognition, strategic visits with plausible explanations for examining family documents or discussing specific heirlooms. Each interaction designed to appear normal while accomplishing critical protection implementation. By late evening, the comprehensive strategic framework had developed across all essential dimensions: legal protection, emergency intervention mechanisms prepared with appropriate documentation, financial security, transaction prevention strategies implemented through regulatory frameworks, evidence preservation, documentation secured through multiple redundant methods, family alliance, strategic support network established with appropriate information sharing, physical protection, access. Plan developed for securing important documents and items, confrontation preparation, structured approach designed for maximum effectiveness. Most importantly, I had established connection with 2 previous victims willing to provide direct testimony during eventual confrontation, their experiences with the same individual under different identity, establishing pattern confirmation beyond documentation evidence. Their participation representing powerful verification source during intervention implementation. The strategic implementation would begin immediately with the most urgent financial protection measures, preventing the mortgage transaction completion that represented immediate significant vulnerability. The regulatory compliance mechanisms providing intervention opportunity without requiring direct confrontation or premature disclosure. Simultaneously, I would initiate the evidence preservation process, ensuring comprehensive documentation availability for eventual confrontation while protecting against potential destruction or concealment attempts. The redundant security measures creating multiple verification sources beyond manipulation possibility. The family alliance development would proceed through careful information sharing, providing appropriate details to essential support network members while maintaining strategic control over comprehensive disclosure. Each ally receiving necessary understanding without compromising overall intervention strategy through premature information distribution. Throughout this preparation phase, would maintain apparent acceptance of the situation during limited contact with my parents, presenting non-threatening positioning to avoid alerting Lucas to intervention development. The strategic patience allowing comprehensive protection implementation before confrontation necessity. As I finalized the strategic framework documentation, I recognized the ironic application of professional skills to personal crisis management. The analytical approach my parents had always criticized as emotional limitation now representing their primary protection against a predator specifically exploiting their desire for emotional connection and validation. The corporate restructuring expertise typically deployed for organizational transformation now applied to family protection implementation. The methodical strategic development typically utilized for business intervention now serving personal relationship preservation through calculated application. Most importantly, I recognize the necessity of maintaining emotional detachment during implementation phase, setting aside the personal impact of being explicitly replaced and declared as a disappointment to focus exclusively on protection necessity. The strategic objective requiring composed execution rather than emotional reaction. My parents had embraced a replacement son offering everything they found lacking in me. They had explicitly rejected the analytical, methodical approach that now represented their only protection. The intervention would proceed not from emotional vindication but strategic necessity. My initial strategic intervention proceeded with calculated precision, the mortgage transaction prevention requiring immediate implementation while maintaining appearance of uninvolvement. Margaret Chen's specialized knowledge provided perfect mechanism through regulatory compliance frameworks requiring minimal direct engagement. The financial institution has legal obligation to verify identity authentication and transaction authorization, she explained, submitting the formal inquiry documentation we had prepared. This creates 72-hour mandatory review period without requiring your parents' direct involvement. The carefully worded regulatory compliance request, citing potential identity verification concerns rather than direct fraud accusation, triggered automatic transaction suspension without alerting Lucas to intervention source identification. The strategic approach creating protection implementation without revealing developing opposition to his operation. Meanwhile, I established initial family alliance expansion through controlled information sharing, meeting with my father's brother Richard, whose banking background provided both relevant expertise and trusted family positioning. "I've noticed concerning changes in their investment approach," he confirmed after reviewing selected evidence portions. "Your father has always maintained diversified, conservative strategy. These recent high-risk consolidations are completely uncharacteristic. His validation providing essential verification beyond my personal assessment, independent confirmation of behavior modification patterns consistent with manipulation indicators. His professional background offering additional implementation assistance through specialized financial protection mechanisms. We can establish secondary verification requirements on primary accounts," he suggested, industry experience creating strategic advantage. Regulatory compliance provisions allow authorized third-party notification without primary account holder restrictions under potential exploitation circumstances. This approach enabling transaction monitoring implementation without alerting Lucas to surveillance establishment, the notification protocols creating early warning system for potential liquidation attempts while maintaining strategic concealment during investigation expansion. The most challenging implementation phase required direct engagement with my parents, strategic access necessary for both evidence gathering and key documents securing without revealing intervention development. This delicate balance requiring perfect performance maintenance during highly sensitive interaction. I arranged casual lunch meeting with my father, presenting business consultation pretext for financial discussion opportunity. The approach designed to appear consistent with our established relationship patterns while enabling critical information gathering during seemingly normal conversation. "I've been considering investment diversification," I explained, creating natural context for relevant inquiry. "Your portfolio management experience would provide valuable perspective for my approach development." My father's enthusiasm for financial discussion creating perfect opportunity for strategic information extraction, his detailed explanation of recent investment changes revealing alarming methodology confirmation. The exciting opportunities Lucas had identified involving systematic liquidation of stable investments for high risk, difficult to trace alternatives with minimal documentation requirements. Most concerning was the casual mention of property leverage strategy, the pending mortgage transaction described as capital access mechanism for these investments rather than traditional financing purpose. The approach consistent with previous victim patterns showing asset encumbrance for liquid resource extraction rather than legitimate investment purpose. "Lucas has revolutionary approach to capital utilization," my father explained with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "Traditional investment strategies waste potential through unnecessary security prioritization." Each statement providing additional confirmation of manipulation impact. The historically conservative financial manager now embracing high-risk approaches with undefined parameters and minimal documentation. The personality modification representing classic exploitation indicator beyond specific transaction concerns. During office visit pretext, I successfully secured copies of essential family documents, original will versions, trust establishment paperwork, important family records requiring preservation. The strategic access creating evidence backup source while extracting irreplaceable documentation from potential destruction vulnerability. Most valuable was discovering original family trust documentation clearly contradicting Lucas's claimed dissolution authority, specific provisions requiring unanimous agreement among multiple trustees rather than primary beneficiary authorization alone. This discrepancy creating critical legal intervention opportunity through procedural requirement violation rather than intent challenge necessity. Aunt Catherine's strategic alliance implementation provided essential observation channel, her regular interactions revealing increasing isolation patterns and communication monitoring indicators. Her detailed reports documenting Lucas's consistent presence during all phone conversations and visit restrictions limiting private communication opportunity. "Your mother seems increasingly anxious during our calls," she reported during secure communication. "She checks with Lucas before answering even basic questions about their schedule or activities." This behavior modification confirming advanced manipulation stage development, the previously independent decision-maker now exhibiting classic control vulnerability indicators through permission-seeking behavior and autonomous decision limitation. Richard's financial surveillance implementation yielded critical threat identification, transaction attempt notification revealing liquidation effort targeting investment account previously undiscovered during initial investigation. The early warning system enabling immediate intervention through compliance verification requirement before completion possibility. By week's end, the initial protection implementation had achieved critical objectives: mortgage transaction prevention successful through regulatory suspension, account monitoring systems established through compliance frameworks, essential documentation secured through strategic access, and behavioral confirmation obtained through trusted observation channels. Most importantly, these interventions proceeded without alerting Lucas to coordinated opposition development, each protection implemented through seemingly unrelated mechanisms appearing as standard procedural requirements rather than targeted intervention components. The strategic concealment maintaining critical advantage during preparation phase completion. Lucas's response to initial transaction complications revealed valuable behavioral insight, his reaction combining aggressive resolution demands with careful explanatory development from my parents. The approach simultaneously pressuring financial institutions while maintaining manipulation narrative integrity through regulatory inefficiency, framing rather than acknowledging potential fraud investigation. Implications. This reaction pattern providing important strategic intelligence for subsequent intervention planning, confirmation of sophisticated operation awareness while revealing specific pressure point vulnerability through timeline disruption impact. The acceleration indicators suggesting implementation schedule dependency beyond simple opportunity exploitation. My parents remained completely convinced of Lucas's authenticity despite emerging complications, their emotional investment creating perception barrier against question consideration or concern recognition. The psychological manipulation demonstrating remarkable effectiveness beyond financial control establishment. The initial moves had established critical protection foundation while confirming sophisticated operation parameters beyond initial assessment. The intervention development proceeding according to strategic framework while accumulating essential evidence for eventual confrontation implementation. Lucas believed his operation proceeded without opposition beyond minor procedural complications. He remained unaware of the comprehensive intervention developing methodically around him. The strategic advantage maintaining critical concealment during protection implementation phase. 2 weeks into strategic implementation, Lucas showed first signs of recognizing coordinated opposition rather than isolated complications. His acceleration attempts becoming increasingly transparent, new financial institutions contacted for potential relationship establishment, alternative investment vehicles suddenly prioritized, previously unmentioned, time-sensitive opportunities, requiring immediate commitment. Your father called asking for contact at Meridian Trust, Richard reported during our secure communication channel. Lucas apparently recommended immediate diversification through new banking relationship despite their 50-year history with First National. This approach matching documented pattern from previous victim cases, financial institution diversification preceding major extraction attempt when initial channels encountered unexpected resistance. The strategy designed to identify less protected access points while complicating coordination between security mechanisms. My response required careful escalation balance, implementation acceleration necessary to counter Lucas's adaptation while maintaining strategic concealment for comprehensive intervention completion. This delicate equilibrium demanding precise timing rather than reactive response. Margaret initiated secondary protection phase, formal fiduciary responsibility inquiry through regulatory compliance framework requiring comprehensive transaction documentation rather than simple verification. The approach creating additional protection layer while establishing official record for potential legal proceedings without requiring direct family involvement. The documentation requirements trigger automatic regulatory oversight for all connected accounts, she explained. This creates formal monitoring protocol without necessitating fraud accusation or emergency intervention application. Meanwhile, extended family awareness expanded through carefully controlled information distribution, key family members receiving appropriate situation briefing with specific observation assignments rather than comprehensive disclosure. Each participant provided necessary understanding for their strategic function without compromising overall intervention coordination through premature information dissemination. My father's sister Elizabeth, initially skeptical of intervention necessity, provided unexpected verification after brief visit to my parents' home. "Something is seriously wrong," she reported immediately afterward. "Your father seems almost sedated during financial discussions, deferring completely to Lucas on topics he's specialized in for decades. Your mother checks her responses with Lucas through eye contact before answering even basic questions." This independent confirmation from previously reserved family members strengthening intervention justification beyond my personal assessment, objective observation validating manipulation indicators through unrelated perspective. The behavioral change is apparent even during brief, superficial interaction suggesting advanced control establishment beyond initial evaluation. Most significant development came through Catherine's strategic observation implementation, her regular visits revealing concerning physical changes beyond behavioral modifications. "Your mother's medication arrangement has been completely reorganized," she noted during secure communication. "Lucas now manages all prescription distribution with elaborate tracking system he controls entirely." This development representing serious escalation beyond financial exploitation, potential physical vulnerability creation through medication management assumption. The approach consistent with advanced manipulation stages documented in previous cases where victim dependency increased through health management control establishment. Robert's financial intelligence network yielded critical pattern identification. Lucas had attempted similar operation targeting another wealthy couple approximately 200 miles away simultaneously with my parents' situation development. The parallel operation apparently abandoned abruptly following my unexpected appearance at the family dinner. This suggests operation capacity limitation requiring prioritization decision, Robert assessed. Your intervention creating sufficient complication to justify alternative target abandonment for resource concentration. This intelligence providing strategic advantage through operation parameter understanding, confirmation of resource limitations affecting Lucas's capability to manage multiple complications simultaneously. The vulnerability creating potential pressure application opportunity through coordinated resistance implementation. Meanwhile, previous victim cooperation expanded beyond initial documentation, 3 former targets providing detailed testimony records describing identical methodology across different identity iterations. Their experiences creating comprehensive pattern verification while establishing critical timeline consistency for exploitation progression demonstration. Most valuable was participation agreement from Victor and Elizabeth Carrington, the Colorado couple targeted during Lucas's, Thomas Wright, identity phase whose intervention implementation had triggered his geographic relocation approximately 8 months earlier. Their willingness to provide direct testimony during confrontation representing powerful verification source beyond documentation evidence. "We nearly lost everything," Victor explained during our secure video conference. He had established complete control over our finances and begun systematic isolation from family when our daughter's intervention finally broke the manipulation pattern. Their experience providing both strategic guidance for effective approach development and powerful testimony for eventual confrontation implementation. The successful intervention precedent creating valuable methodology refinement opportunity while confirming potential effectiveness beyond theoretical assessment. Lucas's awareness of coordinated resistance became increasingly evident through behavioral adaptation, new urgency surrounding alternative financial arrangement establishment, intensified family isolation efforts limiting outside contact opportunity, and accelerated timeline implementation for remaining exploitation components. His strategic adjustments revealing recognition of opposition development without specific intervention source identification. "Your father canceled our standing golf commitment for the 3rd consecutive week," Richard reported. When pressed for explanation, he mentioned Lucas arranging private financial consultation requiring scheduling flexibility and confidentiality maintenance. This isolation intensification representing classic defense mechanism deployment from sophisticated exploitation operation, contact limitation reducing external influence possibility while strengthening manipulation effectiveness through information control and perspective restriction. The approach attempting vulnerability reinforcement against growing intervention pressure. My parents showed first subtle resistance indications despite continued manipulation effectiveness, occasional question emergence regarding transaction necessity, hesitation expressions during new commitment discussions, momentary doubt manifestation quickly suppressed through Lucas's reassurance application. These minor deviation incidents suggesting subconscious recognition development despite conscious acceptance maintenance. Your mother asked about previous investment performance verification during their advisory meeting, Catherine observed during coincidental presence. Lucas immediately redirected conversation while characterizing the question as unnecessary distraction from priority opportunities requiring immediate attention. These small resistance moments providing strategic timing indication for confrontation implementation, the emerging doubt creating potential receptivity foundation for evidence presentation despite continued conscious rejection probability. The psychological preparation suggesting approaching vulnerability window requiring careful preparation completion coordination. The comprehensive evidence compilation neared completion, financial documentation secured, legal verification established, witness testimony prepared, behavioral pattern confirmation developed, and protection implementation stabilized. The intervention components achieving necessary preparation status for coordinated confrontation execution. Margaret provided final strategic framework during preparation conclusion meeting, the approach balancing immediate protection necessity with effective confrontation implementation requirements. The timing considerations addressing both exploitation acceleration and psychological receptivity factors through coordinated intervention development. The confrontation requires precise orchestration, she emphasized. Sufficient protection implementation to prevent further exploitation while creating effective evidence presentation environment for maximum impact possibility. The storm had gathered comprehensive intervention force through methodical preparation rather than emotional reaction. The strategic patience allowing complete component assembly before coordinated deployment necessity despite acceleration pressure from Lucas's increasing awareness of developing opposition. My parents remained convinced of Lucas's authenticity despite growing subconsciousness resistance indicators. They remained unaware of the comprehensive intervention prepared methodically for their protection. The gathering storm positioned for precise deployment when vulnerability window created optimal effectiveness opportunity. The intervention implementation proceeded through family gathering pretext, my parents' upcoming anniversary providing natural occasion for extended family presence without alerting Lucas to orchestrated confrontation preparation. The approach creating appropriate environment for comprehensive evidence presentation while ensuring necessary witness presence for both protection provision and testimony verification. Margaret, Robert, and I arrived together, our coordinated appearance presenting united professional front rather than emotional family confrontation. Richard and Catherine positioned strategically within existing family context, their established relationship presence providing normalized environment appearance despite intervention participation. Most crucial was the Carringtons' arrival timing, their introduction delayed until necessary foundation establishment through preliminary evidence presentation. Their appearance representing powerful verification mechanism beyond documentation evidence through direct victim testimony provision. Lucas's initial reaction to my coordinated arrival with unfamiliar professionals revealed first control fracture, momentary calculation expression quickly masked behind practice charm as he assessed potential threat level without sufficient information for appropriate response calibration. Daniel mentioned bringing colleagues interested in father's investment approach, my mother explained, unwittingly providing perfect introduction context through manipulation narrative repetition. Lucas has revolutionized their portfolio strategy through innovative opportunity identification. Exactly our interest area, Margaret responded smoothly, establishing professional credibility while concealing actual purpose. Financial innovation presents fascinating consideration matrix between opportunity recognition and appropriate security maintenance. The strategic conversation direction creating perfect foundation for documentation introduction, seemingly casual discussion environment while establishing critical concept framework for subsequent evidence presentation. The approach providing organic transition opportunity rather than confrontational declaration necessity. My father's reaction to preliminary discussion revealed important psychological vulnerability, his instinctive professional engagement with complex financial concepts temporarily overriding Lucas's influence framework through authentic expertise activation. This natural response creating essential receptivity window for initial evidence introduction despite continued conscious manipulation acceptance. The regulatory compliance environment creates interesting challenges for non-traditional investment vehicles, I noted, creating context for first evidence presentation. Documentation verification requirements particularly relevant for identity authentication consistency across multiple transaction platforms. This framing allowing natural introduction of first evidence component, the identity verification documentation revealing Lucas's multiple previous iterations through regulatory filing comparison. The presentation appearing as casual professional observation rather than deliberate accusation development. Interesting pattern similarity, Robert observed, examining the seemingly random documentation I had provided. These regulatory filings show identical methodological structure despite different identity applications. Professional background indicators suggest consistent operational parameters across seemingly unrelated presentations. Lucas's reaction confirms sophisticated operation awareness, his expression showing recognition calculation rather than confusion manifestation as identification material emerged through apparently coincidental discussion direction. The response revealing experienced practitioner assessment rather than innocent misinterpretation concern. My mother's first defense deployment followed predictable psychological protection pattern, immediate dismissal through relevance questioning rather than content engagement. This seems unnecessarily technical for anniversary celebration context, she noted with practiced social deflection. Perhaps we could discuss more appropriate topics. The technical aspects actually connect directly with your current situation, I responded calmly, maintaining professional framing rather than emotional engagement. These regulatory verification anomalies correlate with concerning pattern recognition relevant to recent financial modifications affecting your specific portfolio structure. This transition creating context for second evidence component introduction, the financial transaction documentation showing systematic liquidation pattern and control transfer implementation. The presentation maintaining professional analysis appearance while establishing clear exploitation demonstration beyond theoretical concern development. Lucas implemented classic counter strategy, credibility undermining through emotional motivation suggestion rather than evidence content engagement. Daniel has always struggled with perceived accomplishment comparison, he noted with practiced sympathy. This elaborate financial conspiracy construction simply represents unfortunate manifestation of that psychological framework. The anticipated deflection attempt providing perfect introduction opportunity for independent verification sources beyond my personal documentation, Richard's professional banking background creating ideal credibility foundation for objective assessment provision without emotional motivation vulnerability. My analysis confirms systematic liquidity extraction pattern inconsistent with legitimate investment methodology, he stated, supporting documentation validation through independent professional verification. The transaction structure demonstrates clear exploitation indicator alignment rather than strategic portfolio management development. Lucas's response stratification revealed increasing control fracture, momentary hostility expression quickly suppressed through calculated recovery attempt as intervention sophistication recognition exceeded initial threat assessment. The composure fluctuation demonstrating strategic recalibration requirement through unanticipated opposition complexity recognition. The critical confrontation phase implementation required precise timing coordination, the Carrington's introduction representing powerful verification mechanism requiring appropriate foundation establishment through preliminary evidence presentation. Their appearance providing undeniable pattern confirmation beyond documentation evidence through direct victim testimony. Victor and Elizabeth Carrington documented identical methodology application through your Thomas Wright identity iteration, Margaret stated as they entered precisely on cue. Their experience demonstrates consistent pattern implementation confirming operational continuity across multiple identity presentations. Lucas's control fracture expanded significantly, visible calculation intensity revealing strategic option limitation recognition as confrontation sophistication exceeded prepared counter-response capabilities. The practiced performance temporarily suspended through unexpected development processing requirement. My father's resistance framework showed first substantial deterioration, his expression reflecting confusion transition toward recognition possibility as evidence compilation created unavoidable pattern acknowledgement necessity. The professional analytical framework temporarily overriding emotional manipulation influence through objective assessment activation. The documentation presents concerning correlation parameters, he acknowledged, financial expertise momentarily superseding psychological manipulation effects. These transaction patterns demonstrate irregular authorization implementation inconsistent with established security protocols. Lucas attempted recovery through relationship leverage application, emotional connection emphasis attempting vulnerability reinforcement against emerging evidence recognition. These strangers present elaborate technical distraction from our family connection development, he insisted, redirecting towards psychological manipulation strength rather than addressing factual evidence presentation. The anticipated strategy shift creating perfect introduction opportunity for comprehensive evidence synthesis, the complete documentation portfolio demonstrating methodical operation implementation across multiple victims through identical approach application. The presentation organized for maximum impact through strategic component coordination rather than overwhelming volume deployment. The evidence establishes clear pattern recognition through multiple verification sources, I explained calmly, maintaining professional framing throughout presentation. Financial documentation, regulatory filings, previous victim testimony, and independent professional analysis collectively confirming systematic exploitation operation rather than isolated coincidence interpretation. My mother's psychological protection framework demonstrated increasing strain, her expression revealing cognitive dissonance development as evidence volume overwhelmed denial capability despite continued emotional resistance. The protective rationalization increasingly difficult to maintain against comprehensive documentation presentation. The confrontation reached critical effectiveness threshold when Victor Carrington provided direct testimony, his personal experience description creating powerful validation mechanism through obvious authenticity beyond formal documentation evidence. His emotional impact providing psychological penetration capability exceeding technical evidence effectiveness despite equal factual validity. He implemented identical approach with us, Victor explained with compelling simplicity. The same investment opportunities, the same trust modification suggestions, the same isolation implementation. We nearly lost everything before intervention stopped the process. Lucas abandoned strategic subtlety for direct counterattack, credibility destruction attempt targeting intervention motivation rather than evidence content. Daniel orchestrated this elaborate deception through professional manipulation resources, he declared, desperation increasingly evident beneath practiced indignation. His lifetime resentment finding expression through calculated defamation coordination. This defensive escalation creating perfect opportunity for final evidence deployment, the comprehensive documentation from multiple independent sources establishing pattern verification beyond individual motivation questioning. The collective evidence volume creating undeniable verification framework through diversity consolidation rather than single source vulnerability. My father's resistance collapsed first, his analytical framework finally overriding emotional manipulation as evidence volume exceeded denial capability. These transaction implementations occurred without my authorization knowledge despite signature presence, he acknowledged, recognition finally superseding manipulation influence. The documentation correlation suggests deliberate deception application rather than legitimate advisory function. Lucas's final strategic attempt involved rapid extraction preparation, subtle exit positioning indicating physical departure intention as control framework dissolution accelerated beyond recovery possibility. The behavioral indicators suggesting abandonment preparation consistent with previous case documentation showing strategic retreat when operation compromise reached unrecoverable threshold. Margaret's anticipation of this response allowed immediate intervention implementation. Security personnel positioned discreetly outside preventing unauthorized departure while maintaining appropriate confrontation environment. The preparation ensuring comprehensive resolution opportunity rather than perpetrator escape possibility during critical vulnerability recognition phase. My mother's resistance dissolved last, her emotional investment creating strongest manipulation vulnerability despite identical evidence exposure. Her expression reflecting profound betrayal recognition as protective denial finally yielded to unavoidable reality acknowledgement through comprehensive documentation presentation. The confrontation achieved complete objective implementation, exploitation operation exposed, manipulation framework dismantled, financial protection established, and perpetrator containment secured. The strategic intervention creating comprehensive resolution opportunity through methodical implementation rather than emotional reaction despite profound personal dimension. Lucas had calculated perfect exploitation opportunity through psychological vulnerability identification. He hadn't anticipated methodical intervention implementation through comprehensive strategic development. His sophisticated operation dismantled through the analytical approach he had exploited through contrast positioning. The days following confrontation implementation proceeded through necessary resolution phases rather than emotional processing, practical recovery requirements taking priority over psychological reconciliation despite profound relationship implications. The methodical approach continuing through aftermath management with same strategic discipline that had characterized intervention development. Law enforcement involvement became immediately necessary, Lucas's documented pattern across multiple jurisdictions creating clear criminal prosecution requirements beyond civil resolution possibilities. Detective Sandra Myers, specialized in elder financial exploitation, coordinated across relevant agencies to ensure comprehensive case development. The evidence compilation you've provided establishes exceptional foundation for prosecution, she acknowledged after reviewing our documentation portfolio. Most cases suffer from fragmented verification sources rather than comprehensive pattern demonstration across multiple jurisdictions. Lucas remained in custody through considerable bail requirement, the flight risk assessment supported by extensive identity manipulation history and significant financial resources from previous operations. His legal representation attempts finding limited effectiveness against overwhelming evidence compilation from multiple independent sources. Financial recovery proceeded through specific methodology developed with regulatory agencies, systematic transaction review identifying recoverable assets while implementing protection mechanisms against further vulnerability exploitation. The process revealing both concerning scope and potential recovery opportunities through coordinated intervention implementation. Approximately 60% of liquidated assets remain potentially recoverable, Robert explained during situation assessment meeting. The strategic acceleration following your initial intervention prohibited complete extraction implementation despite sophisticated methodology application. My father's psychological processing followed predictable pattern, initial shock transitioning through anger phase into analytical engagement as professional framework reasserted dominance over emotional manipulation effects. His management experience creating natural recovery approach through systematic problem resolution rather than reactive response despite significant personal dimension. The transaction documentation reveals deliberate security protocol circumvention, he observed during financial recovery planning, analytical strength providing processing mechanism through practical engagement. The signature verification requirements were systematically manipulated through progressive authorization modification rather than singular override implementation. This practical focus providing essential recovery framework while allowing appropriate emotional processing through indirect engagement rather than overwhelming direct confrontation. The approach facilitating necessary functional restoration while accommodating psychological integration requirements through balanced implementation. My mother's recovery presented greater complexity, her emotional investment creating profound betrayal impact beyond financial exploitation dimensions. The psychological manipulation targeting specific validation needs rather than simple financial opportunity, creating deeper vulnerability reconstruction requirements through fundamental trust disruption recognition. I believed everything he said, she acknowledged during initial therapy session, facilitated by Dr. Helen Weber specializing in exploitation recovery. Every compliment, every expression of appreciation, every statement of understanding that we had supposedly missed with Daniel. The emotional manipulation was more devastating than the financial deception. This recognition representing essential first recovery stage, acknowledgement of manipulation effectiveness through vulnerability identification rather than simple credential misrepresentation. The self-awareness development providing necessary foundation for subsequent protection implementation through pattern recognition capability rather than specific incident response. Most challenging was addressing the replacement dynamic central to Lucas's methodology, his strategic positioning explicitly contrasting with perceived deficiencies in my relationship with my parents. This dimension requiring careful navigation between necessary awareness development and counterproductive guilt generation through inappropriate responsibility attribution. Lucas specifically exploited existing relationship vulnerabilities, Dr. Weber explained during family consultation. His methodology targeting unfulfilled emotional needs rather than simple financial opportunity through sophisticated psychological assessment rather than opportunistic advantage taking. This framing providing important context for recovery development, understanding exploitation pattern without inappropriate blame direction through clear manipulation recognition rather than victim-focused responsibility attribution. The approach facilitating necessary protection implementation without additional psychological damage through misplaced guilt assignment. Extended family provided essential support structure during initial recovery phase, Richard and Catherine maintaining consistent presence while implementing practical assistance rather than emotional processing demands. Their balanced approach creating appropriate recovery environment through functional support prioritization within psychological space provision. The legal proceedings advanced with exceptional efficiency, the comprehensive evidence compilation combined with previous victim testimony creating overwhelming prosecution foundation beyond typical resource limitations. Lucas's sophisticated operation finally encountering opposition exceeding manipulation capability through methodical documentation rather than isolated accusation. The multi-jurisdictional pattern demonstration creates prosecution advantages typically unavailable in isolated exploitation cases, Margaret explained during case progression assessment. The comprehensive evidence portfolio establishes systematic methodology beyond reasonable doubt threshold through multiple independent verification sources. Financial protection implementation proceeded through comprehensive security reconstruction, new account structures with multiple verification requirements, transaction monitoring systems with independent oversight protocols, and strategic distribution frameworks preventing centralized control vulnerability. Each mechanism designed for sustainable protection beyond immediate recovery necessity through systematic approach rather than reactive response. Most significant was the deliberate trust reconstruction process, progressive responsibility restoration through transparent implementation rather than immediate re-establishment. The approach acknowledging necessary verification development through demonstrated reliability rather than assumed trustworthiness despite familial relationship foundation. Trust requires verification integration following exploitation experience, Dr. Weber advised during recovery planning. Transparent accountability mechanisms providing necessary security perception through demonstrated implementation rather than declared intention. Throughout this practical recovery implementation, the psychological processing continued through appropriate therapeutic engagement, professional guidance facilitating necessary emotional integration while maintaining functional restoration progression. The balanced approach addressing both practical necessity and psychological recovery requirements through coordinated implementation rather than segregated processing. The adult adoption reversal proceeded through straightforward legal process, the documented fraud establishing clear grounds for nullification through misrepresentation demonstration. The procedure removing Lucas's legal family member status while maintaining appropriate documentation accessibility for continued prosecution support through necessary evidence preservation. The adoption nullification establishes important symbolic restoration beyond practical legal necessity, Margaret noted during process completion. The psychological recovery benefits from formal relationship termination through explicit rejection documentation rather than implied dissolution. My parents' relationship with me evolved through careful recalibration rather than artificial reconstruction, genuine appreciation emerging for previously criticized analytical abilities through demonstrated protection value rather than theoretical reassessment. The practical evidence of approach validity, creating authentic reevaluation opportunity beyond reactive compensation attempt through crisis response. Your methodical intervention prevented catastrophic outcome beyond financial recovery possibility, my father acknowledged during rare emotional discussion. The strategic discipline we previously criticized as limitation demonstrated essential protection value through practical application. This recognition representing genuine perspective shift rather than temporary gratitude expression, fundamental reassessment through demonstrated value recognition rather than situational appreciation without underlying perspective modification. The transformation emerging through practical evidence rather than theoretical reconsideration despite significant implementation circumstances. My own processing prioritized protection completion above emotional reconciliation, focusing on recovery implementation rather than relationship recalibration despite significant personal implications. The approach maintaining consistent methodology application through aftermath management with strategic discipline continuation despite resolution achievement. The aftermath phase establishing comprehensive recovery foundation through methodical implementation rather than emotional reaction despite profound personal dimension. The protection focus continuing through resolution development with consistent strategic application beyond intervention completion into sustainable security establishment. Lucas had calculated perfect exploitation opportunity through psychological vulnerability identification. He hadn't anticipated comprehensive recovery implementation through strategic aftermath management. The protection continuing beyond intervention completion through methodical resolution development. 1 year following intervention implementation, my parents' anniversary celebration provided appropriate milestone for recovery assessment, the same occasion that had framed confrontation execution now offering natural reflection opportunity through cyclical significance. The gathering demonstrating remarkable transformation through authentic connection rather than strategic positioning despite identical physical setting. Lucas remained incarcerated through successful prosecution, the comprehensive evidence compilation resulting in significant sentence through multiple jurisdiction coordination. His sophisticated operation permanently disrupted through methodical documentation rather than isolated accusation, the pattern recognition creating prosecution advantages beyond typical resource limitations. 17 years with consecutive sentencing structure, Margaret updated during brief consultation preceding the celebration. The multiple jurisdiction prosecution creating cumulative penalty application through sequential implementation rather than concurrent sentencing limitation. Financial recovery had achieved substantial success, approximately 70% of compromised assets recovered through strategic intervention implementation despite sophisticated extraction attempt. The remaining losses mitigated through comprehensive insurance application and regulatory compensation mechanisms activated through formal exploitation documentation. Most significant was the security framework reconstruction, new financial management systems incorporating multiple verification requirements, distributed authority implementation, and strategic oversight integration through independent monitoring protocols. The approach creating sustainable protection beyond specific vulnerability resolution through systematic security implementation rather than isolated exploitation response. My father had re-engaged with financial management through carefully calibrated responsibility restoration, his expertise reintegrated through transparent implementation rather than autonomous control re-establishment. The approach acknowledging necessary verification integration through collaborative methodology rather than independent authority despite substantial recovery achievement. The portfolio reconstruction achieves appropriate security implementation without excessive restriction application, he explained during informal investment discussion. The balanced approach maintaining necessary opportunity engagement while establishing appropriate protection parameters through strategic oversight integration. This recovery dimension demonstrating important psychological restoration beyond practical financial necessity, identity reclamation through meaningful contribution re-establishment rather than simple asset recovery. The process addressing fundamental vulnerability exploitation through purpose restoration rather than merely financial reconstruction despite significant practical importance. My mother's recovery demonstrated equally significant progression, her emotional resilience developing through appropriate therapeutic engagement while establishing effective protection mechanisms against manipulation vulnerability. The process creating sustainable security through pattern recognition capability rather than specific incident response despite profound betrayal experience. I recognize the validation seeking that created initial vulnerability, she acknowledged during rare direct discussion of exploitation experience. The emotional need identification providing essential protection development through pattern recognition rather than simple avoidance implementation. This self-awareness representing crucial protection dimension beyond practical security measures, understanding psychological vulnerability while establishing appropriate boundary maintenance through conscious engagement rather than reactive restriction. The approach creating sustainable protection through understanding development rather than simple limitation implementation despite significant exploitation experience. The family relationship reconstruction proceeded through authentic connection development rather than artificial restoration attempt, genuine appreciation emerging through demonstrated value recognition rather than obligatory acknowledgement through crisis response. The transformation establishing meaningful relationship recalibration through substantive reassessment rather than superficial reconciliation despite significant intervention circumstances. Your analytical approach provided essential protection through methodical application, my father noted during anniversary toast. The strategic discipline demonstrating fundamental value beyond our limited previous assessment through practical implementation rather than theoretical consideration. This recognition representing genuine perspective transformation rather than temporary appreciation expression, fundamental reevaluation through demonstrated application value rather than situational acknowledgement without underlying assessment modification. The perspective shift emerging through practical evidence rather than conceptual reconsideration despite implementation context. Extended family relationships similarly transformed through crisis resolution, authentic connection development replacing superficial interaction patterns through meaningful engagement rather than obligatory association. The experience creating unexpected relationship depth through shared challenge navigation despite difficult implementation circumstances. Richard and Catherine maintained strengthened connection following intervention participation, their cooperation during critical protection implementation creating enhanced relationship foundation through demonstrated reliability rather than assumed trustworthiness. The bond strengthened through practical verification rather than theoretical association despite familial relationship basis. The collaboration created unexpected connection opportunity through shared purpose implementation, Richard observed during private conversation. The protection focus establishing meaningful relationship development beyond previous interaction limitation through practical cooperation rather than social obligation. Most surprising was my parents' friendship development with the Carringtons, their shared exploitation experience creating unique connection opportunity through mutual understanding beyond typical association foundation. The relationship establishing important recovery dimension through experience sharing without requiring artificial commonality creation despite unusual formation circumstances. Their perspective provides invaluable processing context through parallel experience navigation, my mother explained. The mutual understanding offering unique support mechanism beyond theoretical guidance through practical implementation knowledge despite professional assistance importance. My own relationship with my parents evolved through careful recalibration rather than forced reconstruction, authentic appreciation developing through demonstrated value recognition rather than compensatory overemphasis. The transformation emerging naturally through practical experience rather than artificial adjustment despite significant intervention circumstances. The disappointment characterization permanently replaced through genuine value acknowledgement, the analytical approach previously criticized now recognized as essential protection mechanism through demonstrated application rather than theoretical reassessment. The transformation reflecting authentic perspective shift through practical evidence integration rather than obligatory reconsideration despite dramatic demonstration context. Your methodical intervention prevented catastrophic outcome beyond recovery possibility, my father acknowledged without qualification. The strategic discipline representing essential protection value through practical implementation rather than theoretical consideration. This reconstruction phase addressing fundamental vulnerability beyond specific exploitation resolution, establishing sustainable protection framework through comprehensive security implementation while facilitating appropriate psychological recovery through balanced approach development. The process creating meaningful restoration beyond practical necessity through holistic methodology rather than segmented response despite complexity challenges. Most important was the recognition of shared responsibility for protection implementation, appropriate accountability distribution through mutual engagement rather than isolated obligation designation. The approach establishing sustainable security through collaborative implementation rather than dependent protection despite significant vulnerability experience. The security maintenance requires mutual participation through appropriate awareness integration, my mother noted during family discussion. The balanced approach establishing effective protection through shared responsibility rather than dependent implementation despite vulnerability experience. This framework representing crucial developmental achievement beyond specific incident response, creating sustainable security through systematic approach rather than reactive protection through comprehensive methodology rather than isolated intervention. The implementation addressing fundamental vulnerability through systematic resolution rather than symptomatic treatment despite significant exploitation experience. The anniversary celebration itself demonstrated remarkable transformation, authentic connection replacing performance interaction through meaningful engagement rather than strategic positioning. The gathering reflecting genuine relationship development through substantive connection rather than superficial association despite identical physical context with previous confrontation implementation. As I observed this transformed family system functioning through reconstructed parameters, the essential recognition crystallized with perfect clarity. The strategic response to sophisticated exploitation had created more than simple protection implementation. It had generated fundamental relationship recalibration through necessary intervention despite difficult implementation requirements. My parents had replaced me with a sophisticated predator offering emotional validation through vulnerability exploitation. The protection implementation requiring analytical approach they had previously dismissed as fundamental limitation. The reconstruction establishing authentic relationship development through demonstrated value recognition beyond artificial reconciliation. The strategic discipline maintaining consistent methodology application throughout recovery implementation with same systematic approach that had characterized intervention development. The protection continuing beyond crisis response through comprehensive security establishment with sustainable implementation rather than temporary resolution despite significant challenge navigation. As the celebration concluded with genuine connection rather than performance interaction, the transformation completion became evident through authentic engagement rather than strategic positioning. The reconstruction achieving comprehensive restoration through methodical implementation despite profound disruption experience. My parents had discovered genuine appreciation for the analytical approach they had previously rejected. The disappointment transformed into essential protection through demonstrated application value. The reconstruction establishing authentic relationship founded on demonstrated reliability rather than assumed obligation.